You know what I think is annoying? I'll tell you what I think is annoying. When people try to explain how big a trillion is, you've undoubtedly heard people do this. Maybe you've done this yourself. Well, if you stack dollar bills 10 miles high, no one knows what that means. No one can even fathom a trillion, so you might as well stop making people try to understand it. What you do need to understand is this. Debt problems, they get a lot worse, a lot faster than you think they get. Because at the end, compound interest being what it is, and interest rates rising, you can all of a sudden go from having a teeny tiny snowball coming your way to a gigantic snowball that's about to wipe out you and everything you love. Which leads me to Carol Roth, author of the book You Will Own Nothing. I love Carol's books. You should get that one, by the way. Carol, $1.7 trillion in a year? Do I have that right? Would you please explain what I'm looking at?
Well, first of all, Jesse, you're using big words like compound interest, so that's pretty exciting. Really come along with your learning here, so I'll take partial credit for that. So yeah, $1.7 trillion reported deficit is absolutely abysmal, particularly when we, at least at the end of the fiscal year, were not technically in a war, did not have an emergency, and the economy was, again, technically growing. I mean, this is the balance sheet of an emerging market in crisis, normally would lead to a currency crisis, except we have the reserve currency, so that gives the people in Washington this feeling that they're doing okay, except that it's not actually 1.7 trillion. It is actually, Jesse, $2 trillion. And if you went in and you read the CBO reports, which of course you're not going to do because you're cool, but I'm a loser. So I actually went in and read these reports. You will see that there was something, and I'm going to do my best to explain the accounting shenanigans, but there were accounting shenanigans. So basically, this made last year's deficit look like it was too big and this year's like it was too small. What they did was when Biden decided that he was just going to go around the Supreme Court and write off student debt, there was somewhere $300+ billion that they did something like a reserve or a write-off type of accounting thing for, which is, the appropriate way, if that were an actual thing you could do, for the CBO to account for it. And so therefore it made last year, fiscal year 2022's budget, the budget deficit look larger than it actually was because it had put this sort of accounting issue on top of it. When the Supreme Court struck that down, they had to do the opposite. They had to take away this accounting issue. And so they've now cut off $300+ billion. So they didn't actually save from anywhere. They just had to balance out the accounting. Now, it's not that the CBO was trying to trick us before and now. It's just that never should have been a thing in the first place because it's not unconstitutional. But because of that, it's making the deficit look even better at $1.7 trillion than the $2 trillion that it actually is. Absolute, utter insanity.
Carol, it's hard to explain these numbers to people because no one can understand numbers of this size. But when you get to that amount of debt and interest rates, people don't understand how fast the crisis comes. When you bring up the debt to people, they'll say, Jesse, I've heard this my whole life. I was born in the 60s. I was always been warned about this and nothing's ever happened. And I try to explain, yes, a debt crisis doesn't come until it comes, and then we're all screwed.
Right. And if you think about the fact that you now have entities coming out and saying this is unsustainable, where they've kind of kept their mouths a little bit quieter, maybe made it implicit, they are now being explicit. The IMF, who's historically told us that, debt becomes unwieldy and for a sovereign nation, kind of in the 70 to 80% of GDP range, we're now again over 120% of debt to GDP. We've had the Treasury come out and say we're on an unsustainable fiscal path. We've had the Congressional Budget Office come out and say we're on an unsustainable path. So maybe, you don't understand the full scope of it, but it's kind of like your own household. Like, you might be able to get away by, spending a little bit more than you make. But if you go out and you start buying all kinds of things that you can't afford, and then you've got these massive interest rates, you know that eventually you're going to have to file for bankruptcy. We're seeing the outgrowth. We saw our debt get downgraded several months again. I mean, the signposts, everything is flashing red. And yet the people who are in charge of this continue to act arrogantly and refuse to do anything about it.
Speaking of people acting arrogantly, here was Jerome Powell talking about, here he was.
My colleagues and I remain resolute in our commitment to returning inflation to 2% over time. A range of uncertainties, both old ones and new ones, complicate our task of balancing the risk of tightening monetary policy too much against the risk of tightening too little.
Carol, the only way to reduce inflation, unless I'm mistaken, is jacking these interest rates up even further than they are now. We already know that owning a home is pretty much impossible for middle-class people today with these interest rates, that it's squeezing out small businesses. How exactly do we get a soft landing out of all this?
Well, I'm going to take issue. I think the monetarists would say the only way to do this is to jack interest rates, but there's certainly a lot of things that we can do in terms of fiscal policy that would help. One would be balancing our budget. One would be restoring us to energy independence. One would be making it easier for people to build homes and less costly in terms of regulation. One would be getting more people back into the labor force. So there are other things that we could do. But these are the tools, and the only thing that you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and that's basically what the Fed is doing. So in terms of the soft landing narrative, I mean, it would be very, very challenging to bring down inflation and to not have a recession. I think, there are some weird things that sort of make up the backbone of what's going on financially now, where it's possible you could see that for some short period of time where everyone will declare victory. But over the long term, everybody who has sort of an iota of economic brain can see that if we don't have any massive shift in the way that we're spending in this country, if we don't have some massive productivity breakthrough or massive energy breakthrough, that there's no way that we're not going to have, higher inflation for longer. I think that's the most realistic scenario. They're going to get to 3.5% on an ongoing basis and go, this is the new normal. We made up 2, by the way, a decade and a half ago. So now we're just going to make up 3.5 as our new target. It was a valiant effort, and we feel like this is the new normal conditions being the ones that they created. And that's just stealing more money at a more rapid rate from the middle and working class.
Yeah. Carol, you are the best. Her book is You Will Own Nothing. Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks, Jesse.
We're going to get to the border stuff in a moment. I just want to again say, I know you've heard me say it over and over and over again, but it has to be drilled in all of our heads, because we have to start challenging our elected representatives about this. Right now, they should all be meeting to slash and burn government spending to try to stop what's coming. That should be the meeting they have. And nobody, even on the right, is talking about it. Not one elected representative, nobody running for president, nobody's talking about it. Nobody wants to be the guy who cuts spending. And so it's inevitable. It's something else.